So please join me in welcoming Simon into the space and with gratefulness for him for sharing some of his thoughts on this time that we're living in. I'm sure it's going to be really lovely. So, thank you, Simon.
Thank you all, and thank you all for coming out here today. I'm excited to see every one of you that came through the door tonight, particularly because some of the things that I want to talk about with you are ideas that are very dear to my heart, as some of you know, some ideas that I have been mulling over and pondering over for the past few years, and to some extent trying to think about, oh, how can I share this? How can we set up a forum like this? So this is a kind of an important presentation for me in that regard. Some of what I want to present has to do with a way to move forward and a new way to move forward. So I don't want the import of my message to be interfered with by a very conventional type of presentation. So that's why we're sitting here in a circle. As soon as Bertie walked in, she said, "Oh, is this the new paradigm? We're in the circle now?" And of course, the answer is yes. That's right. That's the idea. So what's that all about? That's an idea that relates with a consciousness of group, and that's one of the things that I want to talk about. The way in which people come together from different places and are constantly forming a group, and what happens when people form a group. How does it unfold? So I think that's one of the things I want to ask of you, is just to keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on what it feels like to be part of this group. We are all carrying such a rich storyline, each one of us, and when we come together, to some extent, we come together under a certain thought umbrella, or kind of a thought bubble, if you will, here in this room. And that particular overarching umbrella, I think, is probably the most important factor with regards to our ability to have a conversation here, with regards to what can be said and shared, what can be heard and thought. So in general, what I'd like to do is just ask you to keep an eye on that particular aspect of what's going on here throughout. Okay, thank you for that. By way of providing some context for our discussion tonight, I want to say that I think one of the things we all have in common is that we all share an awareness of the particular nature of the times we're living in tonight. I'm not going to speak about this very much at all, but just by way of mentioning, we're all aware that the best science we have access to today has said that 350 parts per million is the very upper limit of what is safe for the future evolution of life on the planet, and we know that we are at 402 parts and climbing. And we know that we have overshot the carrying capacity of the planet by a factor of 1.7, and that these two things have combined together to create a variety of circumstances, including water shortage and food shortage and starvation in parts of the world, as well as disruption of the weather patterns, increased frequency of severe weather events, flooding, sea level rise, collapse of the ecosystem. The rate of extinction is now between 100 and 1,000 times the historical average. And as well as collapse of nation states and potential collapse of the economic system. So this is the world that we share, the world that we live in, and to some extent this is our, to a greater or lesser extent, this is our grief. What I want to talk about is within the assumption that we are all more or less involved with the project of trying to change the trajectory of modern culture to address these realities. In other words, people who would consider themselves in the category of a social community organizer or a change, an agent of change, or an activist, or something like that. By the way, how many people here kind of connect with some of those terms? Does anyone here consider themselves in one of those categories, a community leader, or an activist, a community organizer, agent of community change? See a smattering of hesitant hands going up. My hope is that by the end of our discussion tonight, we can think about that in terms of something that each and every one of us pertains to. I think that I'm proceeding with the assumption that we're all in that category. So my presentation this evening has to do with worldviews and a change in worldviews. And how I'm going to present an argument to suggest that we are going in a period of transition from one worldview to another, and I want to talk about what impact that is having on our ability to confront these realities, both from the standpoint of how we organize ourselves and how we conduct social action, and what it means to be an activist in the 21st century. I have entitled this talk, Paradigm Lost, and a hopeful new approach to saving the planet. So in the first half hour, I'm going to be talking about Paradigm Lost, and then we'll take a little break, and then in the second half hour we'll come back and I'll talk about a hopeful new approach. So I'm just going to jump right in. Hang on to your seats here. We have a relatively dense presentation here. Okay, so the archetypical paradigm shift has been identified more or less generally as the Copernican revolution. And the Copernican revolution was the transition from a Earth-centric universe to a sun-centric universe. And it got its name from Nikolai Copernicus, who wrote a book on the subject, wrote a treatise on the subject just before he died in the middle of the 16th century. And his work was famously picked up by an Italian fellow by the name of Galileo, who you can see here in this picture. He's a little weather-worn and a little beaten down, perhaps, in his latter years. Galileo was himself a bit of a scrapper, and he needed to be because he had a lot of a fight to carry on, to be able to carry forward this idea. He ended up being convicted by the Inquisition of strong suspicion of heresy, and he was sentenced to house arrest for the last 9 years of his life. And when he finally died, it was said to be due to complications of house arrest. The Galileo, to some extent, he bore the brunt of what we could consider to be an extreme resistance to within the mainstream to accepting a new paradigm and letting go of the one that that they're currently working within. Now, the person who first brought into the popular notion the term paradigm shift is a fellow by the name of Thomas Kuhn, who in around 1968 wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Thomas Kuhn was a historian of science, and he studied and looked after the long history of scientific revolutions. And what he noticed was that there's a certain pattern of the way that one overarching theory is dreamt up and developed and rises to its maturity, and then little by little we get evidence to suggest counter-evidence, and then it ends up getting replaced through a stroke of creative genius by another overarching theory, and that science progressed not in a linear fashion, but in this kind of like jump from one theory to the next. He discovered some very, very interesting aspects about the way that we transition, and I highly recommend the book that he wrote. It has an enormous amount to say about the times that we're in. One of the things he discovered about it was that the incredible resistance of the scientists working within a specific paradigm to let go of the one that they are working within. And he said that in order for the new paradigm to come into its maturity, to some extent, all of the scientists in the previous paradigm need to die off, and we need a new generation of scientists to carry it forward. And this is a pattern that he noticed quite a bit. Why? You know, another thing that he noticed about it was that the paradigm itself was like a big umbrella under which the work of the specific field took place. And because it's sort of the overarching story, very often it was taken for granted. And went into the realm of kind of the assumption, the assumed knowledge. This leads to a specific kind of mistake, whereby it's sort of a necessary mistake that people working within a certain paradigm have to mistake this, which was just a way of looking at reality, have to mistake it for reality itself. And to some extent, because thought takes place within the context of paradigms, we're all, to some extent, victim of this mistake. What I want to propose to you tonight is that the way of looking at reality that we now have mistaken for reality itself is the philosophy of materialism. So what is materialism? In addition to a value system which prizes material goods, materialism is also an assumption that all phenomena can be explained in terms of material interactions, or are the result of material interactions. And this all phenomena includes thought, and it includes consciousness. So we think of thought as, within the materialistic model, thought is actually neurons and neuropeptides firing in the synapses of your brain, and consciousness is sort of an epiphenomenon which spins out from this kind of firing. Materialism, particularly in my family, materialism is often equated with science, or rational thought, hard thinking, evidence-based, logical thinking is what we have with materialism, because it's we have proof and we have the material world to back it up, so we have this kind of rigor to it. However, if we look at the history of materialism, we can see that materialism was never proven by science. It's a form of metaphysics, unproven metaphysics in and of itself. And B, materialism is has a lot of the markings of any other paradigm. It has a birth, it has a process by means of which it grew into its glory, into its full flourishing, and it has a process by means of which we're developing counter-evidence and finally being disproved. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit in this talk here. And we've discussed, let's see what comes up next. Okay. So in order to think back to the roots of materialism, we're back to Galileo. Not only was Galileo considered to be the father of the scientific method, but Galileo also was right there at the very, very beginning of materialism. He was one of the first people to look at, in a systematic way, look at the physical world to verify our assumptions about the way it behaves. And Galileo, incidentally, died on the same year that his successor was born, Sir Isaac Newton. And Sir Isaac Newton, as you may know, was working with new instrumentation, new forms of science, new forms of mathematics, and all of these he combined into an ability to measure the behavior of the material world with mathematical precision. And in so doing, giving birth to Newtonian mechanics, or what could be considered classical physics, what's called classical physics. So at this moment, the scientific process is underway and picking up steam and branching out in a variety of different ways. New fields of science are being developed, and a greater and greater degree of specificity is going on, and as things like chemistry and physics and on and on and on, slowly but surely the dream of being able to explain all phenomena in terms of material phenomena comes into being. And the materialistic model proves to be extremely robust. It provides a fantastic support for the Industrial Revolution, and an enormous amount of knowledge is gained. However, it peaks somewhere around the end of the 19th century, and in the beginning of the 20th century, we are being given evidence to the contrary of this theory. And in particular, in 1905, when Einstein published his special theory of relativity, we have a fairly substantive critique of Newtonian mechanics as being something that pertains to a certain circumstances and in narrow conditions. And as science progressed, the study of molecules goes down to the study of atoms, goes down to the study of subatomic particles, with the quantum physicists following up. We get to a situation where the assumptions of the materialistic paradigm are being dramatically undermined. And that's what I want to talk about today, because I think that it's, like Galileo, who was in this period where he said, look, I look through my telescope, I can see very clearly, I could explain it to you, you'd understand it, and nobody could hear, for the most part. Mainstream society couldn't accept it. We're in a similar passage like that. The frontiers of science have basically said, it doesn't work like that. But mainstream society is still laboring under the assumptions which carry on in our medical system, our judicial system, our economic system, all of these aspects of modern society, which may or may not be working that great at the moment, are to some extent based on this basic assumption. So I have here a little bit of a very, very rough, we're painting in extremely broad strokes here, and you can see just this basic idea of, okay, here's the sort of notion of the materialistic paradigm rising and now falling in the wake of the quantum physicists. There is one particular experiment that I want to talk about that early quantum physicists did, because it is a very, very simple experiment. Many of us probably learned it in high school. I know I did. I didn't understand it at the time. But it is worth looking into because in addition to being extremely fascinating, it's also very, very surprising. It's called the two-slit experiment. And it is so simple that you can make a fairly good representation of it with a ballpoint pen here. We have a source of light, we have a barrier with a couple of slits in it, and we have a screen. The screen being in this case being like a photosensitive screen. So you shoot some light, in this case a single wavelength beam of light in the direction of the slits, and the question is what happens on the screen, and you might expect you'd get two kind of two big blobs that correspond to the two slits. But actually what happens is you get a series of patterns that looks not unlike this here, of what happens when the light goes through the slits. And the reason for this has to do with the wave characteristics of light. So as you can think of concentric circles like the ripples from a pond going out from a single thing, drops the wave go out like this, and then when it hits the two slits, then it branches out into two sets of concentric circles, and then these sets of concentric circles interfere with one another and create a kind of an interference pattern. So you can imagine, here's a picture of, you can't see the second ball, but it's behind the person's head. He's creating two different sets of concentric circles, and you can see here that we have where wave meets wave, they reinforce each other. Where wave meets valley, we get a void, and you can see these voids here. Right here's a void, here's a void, right? So those peaks and valleys correspond to the peaks and valleys of the light pattern. Okay, so far so good. This actually is not quantum physics. We're still well within the realm of classical optics. And this particular experiment was discovered by a fellow named Young in 1801 and understood at that time. So this is very well-trod territory. We are moving into the realm of quantum weirdness pretty quickly now, because when you look, each one of these fields of light here is made up of little tiny points, and each one of those points is the result of a photon hitting the screen. And when you look at the specific way that the photon gets there, it becomes very, very interesting. So we create a thought experiment, which, by means of which we can shoot out a single photon out of a little projector. And here we have a slide which shows what happens to the photons when you shoot them out one by one at the screen. And you can see here in this picture that they're clustering in lines which are in accordance with the peaks and valleys that we saw earlier, even when you shoot them one by one. Now, why is that? The photon, which is a single, we think of as a single little particle, making its way through the slits, is now interfering with itself going through the slits and forcing itself into peaks and valleys when it hits the screen. And the reason is that the photon does not exist as a discrete entity until it lands on the screen. Rather, it exists as a probabilistic field. Where is the photon? The photon, in a way, it hits the screen. In a way, it goes through one slit. In a way, it goes through the other slit. And in the way, it does none of these things. The probabilistic field has the qualities of a wave pattern, and that's why the single photon interferes with itself before it gets to the screen. Now, if you like that, you're going to love this. This is an experiment that has been repeated over and over again with the same conclusive results with a variety of different entities going through. But let's just stick with photons for the time being. We have a sensor here, and the sensor's job is to tell, it says a little laser, and it can tell when the photon goes through that slit. Right? After all, the photon did make it to the screen. It had to have gone through one slit or the other slit, so let's just check and see which slit it goes through. So when the photon goes through the top slit, the sensor gives off a beep, and when it goes through the bottom slit, the sensor is silent. And by means of that, we count up the beeps, we can figure out which photons went through which ones. And so what do you suppose happens to our wave pattern when the photons get to the screen? Turns out they land on the screen the way you would expect if they were particles, and so the wave pattern is now gone. Why? The photon consolidates its existence at the moment when it is being perceived by this device. It crystallizes at that moment, and from then on it continues on as a particle. No interference. It doesn't interfere with itself, doesn't create a wave pattern, it just goes through and hits the screen just as you'd expect. So this experiment has been replicated not just with photons, it's been done with electrons, it's now been accomplished with atoms, it's been accomplished with molecules, and always we get the same results. And they tell a story about the way matter works, which was first expressed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in 1927, and it's called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. And the idea is that subatomic particles exist not as discrete entities, but rather as probabilistic, non-localized fields until they are condensed and crystallized by the perceiving consciousness of some sort. As it turns out now, the Copenhagen interpretation is the orthodox interpretation of quantum physics. The vast majority of quantum physicists believe in this. Quantum physics as a field has been proven over and over again, and we have an enormous amount of technology and things that would not be here were it not for quantum physics. So we can say just as without the Industrial Revolution we couldn't have driven here in our cars, without the quantum revolution we couldn't be projecting this thing up on the screen here. So it's a also a very, very robust model. The people in the day were freaking out, needless to say. They were reacting much the way the Catholic Church was, violent reaction. And here we have Werner Heisenberg, who was one of the founders and fathers of quantum physics, and also one of the the founder of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is related to all of this, saying, the violent reaction on the recent development of modern physics can only be understood when one realizes that here the foundations of physics, and now we're talking about classical physics, have started moving, and that this motion has caused the feeling that the ground would be cut from science. So we have a development within science which is a radical departure from all of the assumptions of the previous 200 years of science, and people are behaving like the world is falling apart, because in some ways it is. Now, notice here that we're having a little bit of a reversal with regards to consciousness and matter. This is an important point here I want you guys to take in. Whereas within the materialistic model, we think of consciousness as being the epiphenomenon of neurons firing in the brain. So in other words, consciousness is made out of matter. Here, we have matter being crystallized into a discrete entity by consciousness. This particular notion is one which is radical from the standpoint of modern America. However, it is not radical historically speaking. In fact, you don't have to go far to find a tradition which speaks about the way in which mind, the role of mind in the creation of this world. This is something which is relatively present throughout the wisdom traditions of this world, throughout the mystical traditions of this world. And I'll just pick out one here because it's particularly famous. This is a quote. This is the first line of the Dhammapada, which is, there's a lot of writings of the Buddha which are not really considered historically accurate. However, the Dhammapada is part of the original Pali Canon, and this is, the scholarship is saying this is a relatively authoritative text. The very first line, the Buddha says, all phenomena are preceded by mind and ruled by mind. They are mind-made. All phenomena are mind-made. A lot has been made of this. I'm sure you've encountered some connections between the wisdom traditions of the world and the findings of quantum physics. But I wanted to lay this out because this is a very kind of central point with regards to this notion of the way in which our dominant paradigm is on the decline. And to some extent, we're living in a sort of paradigm no man's land to some extent nowadays. That's about as much time as I want to spend on Paradigm Lost at this point. And the rest of this presentation is about what does this mean for how we go about doing the business of changing the direction of modern culture. Should we take just 2 questions, and then we can take a break? We don't need to. Is this information well-trod territory for everyone in the group, or is there some? David, hi.
Did you just say what we need to do to change the direction?
Yeah.
Why do we need to do anything?
To change the direction.
Yeah. Why do we? Let's come back to that after the second I
part.
didn't mean to put you on the spot. That's the spot I'm on.
Okay.
I wouldn't do that to you, so.
No. I think that
That's a good question.
question is why. Well, just so I understand the context of your question, are you saying?
Well, you've talked about how things seem to be inevitable in terms of their ebb and flow or change. And so if the change is inevitable, is it dependent on any one of us doing anything? Or is it a matter of our collective cumulative wisdom that finally defines what comes next?
What I want to do is just review a little bit about the story we were just telling and take a look at that within the context of industrial culture, industrial society. And I guess the other word we can use is consumptive culture. So we see here again the same rise and fall of the materialistic paradigm. And so as we know from the word materialism referring both to a philosophical system and to a value system which prizes material goods, right off the bat we know that there's some kind of connection between materialism and consumption. If we extrapolate from there, the notion of the material world as being the main, the real world, that which truly exists, it would be natural for us to put our value in those things, right? And have to acquire them. When we have to acquire them, we have to produce them, we have to consume them, and you can see how this would be a big motor for the overconsumption of the planet. Likewise, it sort of sets us up in this sort of modern lifestyle of living fix to fix. And why? Because we have this assumption that, okay, the real world is out there, so therefore, whatever dissatisfaction I'm feeling, whatever kind of contentment I'm seeking, I'm going to have to find it out there. There's a way in which we have to set ourselves up to go out and acquire, to go out and experience. So we go out to dinner. And while we're out to dinner, we're thinking about maybe the next thing. And, afterwards we're going to go to a movie, and that was lovely. Maybe we should have some gelato afterwards. And have you heard about the new iPhone 7 or whatever it is? This kind of thing. So because we kind of get in this sort of cycle of fix to fix, and you can imagine what kind of motor that sets up with regards to the overconsumption. As you may know, the average American is over-consuming has overshot the carrying capacity of the planet by a factor of five times what the planet could carry. And the motor of that has a lot to do with that. So along with this notion of living fix to fix, we also have this sort of a little bit of a shrinking of our horizon. What's my experience? What's in it for me? And to some extent, there's sort of a shrinking of the temporal horizon. So far from evaluating our actions in terms of its impact on the next 7 generations, as the I believe the Abenaki Indians were said to have done. We have having trouble now evaluating our impact on the 2nd generation. Right? We're in a situation now where we are basically exploiting the future resiliency of the planet in favor of the economic profits, right? Economic gain. So it's a very, very short-term kind of temporal shrinking of the temporal horizon that we're up against right now. And likewise, we could also say there's a shrinking of the community horizon. The third world, other species, the planet as a whole, these are to some extent outside of the community that we are taking into account with regards to the consequences of our actions. We have some other community involved, which is a little bit more like us. If we were taking into account future generations and the third world and the other species and things like that, we would be making very different decisions. So again, we have we are in the modern age subject to a certain kind of, not just short-sightedness, but a sort of a shrinking of our horizons. This too is related to sort of the paradigm that we're working under. Now, if we remember this sort of reversal that we were talking about with regards to the implications of the new paradigm that we're moving towards, we could say, roughly speaking, we're talking about kind of a consciousness-centric paradigm. And the proposal that I want to make here is that just as the materialistic paradigm is beautifully suited for creating industrial/consumptive culture, the consciousness-centric paradigm is fantastic for creating sustainable culture. This is the tool we need to carry us through this particular juncture. And you can imagine how, if we're starting to believe in the inner landscape of the interpersonal landscape as being the real land from which this world is born, so too we could easily imagine that this could be the source of our contentment as well. Looking inwards for the satisfaction to whatever dissatisfaction is plaguing us at the moment, and you can see how is a much more sustainable. That quells the fires of consumption enormously, right? So again, we have a nice kind of correspondence there about about how this fits together. Likewise, if you are one who believes that. And by the way, that's true, that the inner landscape is the source of our true contentment. I guess that goes without saying. But if you're one who believes, as was said, that it is mind, it is consciousness, which creates the world within which the world that we inhabit, then you would probably think that the qualities of mind, the nature of mind, are going to be recapitulated in the world that's around us, are going to be remanifested. So if we can say we have a certain kind of pollution in the mind, it may be manifested in terms of pollution in the atmosphere. Now, based on that notion, are we going to be able to clean up the pollution in the atmosphere without addressing its source in terms of the pollution in the mind? Not if you believe in a consciousness-centric paradigm. Are we going to be able to create a machine that's going to suck all of the air through it and pull out the carbon and put it in little cubes and store it somewhere and thereby reduce the CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere with doing nothing to our internal condition? Not if you believe in a consciousness-centric paradigm. So this consciousness-centric approach, it has, as Dave was pointing out, it has some automatic results with regards to the way in which it quells the fires of consumption. But it also has some more practical results with regards to strategy about how we move forward. And this is the other side, and we'll see how this holds up to Dave's inquiry as we move along. Point, and that is the much of what we are currently doing to in the form of activism or community change is influenced by the materialistic paradigm. In particular, a certain materialist by the name of Karl Marx continues to have a very strong influence on how we go about it. And one of the things I want to point out about this model is that it sets up a dichotomy. There is a kind of implicit us and them-ism in protest politics. There is an us and them in fighting structures of oppression. So for instance, a campaign that we're all familiar with and probably think very highly of, the campaign against the Keystone Pipeline, and this question about how can we get the people who are owning the oil companies to have the long vision and not create this Keystone Pipeline. Again, we created a little bit of a dichotomy between us and them, and then what immediately happens is they become aware of us and they marginalize us, right? So we become marginalized in terms of especially the power system, and then we can spend our time fighting against one another. So this question of finding your target, developing your strategy to change their behavior is one that evokes resistance right off the bat. And it also does a couple of other things. One of the other things it does is it starts to, for those of us as organizers, it directs a lot of our attention towards the problem. Sometimes people say energy follows thought. Putting all of your energy into the problem may be in some ways reinforcing it with all of the mental energy you're putting into it. Likewise, it creates a very stressy environment for the organizer. Why? Because they're in battle, right? They have an opposition. They're trying to get someone else to change. Along with this stress comes, particularly in the inner cities, comes a phenomenon of addiction and burnout. And anybody who's ever been through either of these knows that this is not a pretty picture. This is a very messy situation. And so the organizer very often is in the situation of feeling burnout coming on, wondering why the people around them aren't working quite as hard as they are, and they say to themselves, okay, I'm going to dig in, I'm going to double down here, and it's self-perpetuating in that way. And meanwhile, people looking at you, you're saying, why aren't they helping? They're the last thing they want to do is be more like you, right? Because they see you're definitely on a downward trend here, and they want to get as far away from you as possible. So in other words, the organizer in that situation has a tendency to be under a company, right? So we have the opposition rising up. We have the opposition rising up, and we have the forces for change kind of shrinking. And you can kind of imagine how this sort of thing is creates a difficulty. So as a result, to some extent, as a result of this model of organizing, which has these kinds of difficulties to it, there is a new model of organizing. That's what I want to talk about, which is positive, inclusive, and local, building a future together that we all can get behind. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to refer to this as the inside-out approach to social action. If you're hanging around the Center for Transformational Practice, we might call it the transformational approach to social action. But those are more or less the same here. But and the notion of the inside-out approach is that it is the raising of consciousness that is the foundation of sustainable culture, and also the foundation of our ability to create sustainable culture. Why? We're in the consciousness first paradigm here, 21st century. So now I want to come back to this question about what is the front line of the environmental movement. And if we have this assumption that it is the level of consciousness, it is the raising of consciousness, the one consciousness that we all have some control over is our own. So this is we're talking about bringing the front line of the environmental movement kind of very much within arm's reach, and thinking about it in terms of how am I taking care of my own inner landscape? How am I cultivating my own inner qualities? That might mean simple things like just taking care of yourself, getting enough sleep, eating healthy foods. It might involve things like reading uplifting literature, or getting out into the natural world, getting enough rest, or keeping the company of uplifted individuals, engaging in some kind of personal practice. All of these things become, to some extent, our responsibility, not just to ourselves, but to the planet. And what happens is the consciousness of the individual, it doesn't just stay in and of itself, because as soon as we leave our dooryard, all of a sudden we're getting into groups. We're mixing with other people, and just as we are here tonight. Depending upon the inner qualities of the individual has everything to do with what's going to happen at that next stage when you get into groups. And that's what I want to talk about here. If we think about the individual as then spreading out to the collective could be anything. The collective could be your family, your household, some working group, some board that you're on, right here, this group here. Whatever it is, there's a way in which the quality of consciousness of the collectiveness has a lot to do with what that collective is able to accomplish. And here I want to draw on some work that was done by an organizational theorist currently working at MIT. His name is Otto Scharmer, and he has written probably the most influential book about organizational theory in the past decade, called Theory U. And he studied an enormous number of group meeting situations and in terms of level of consciousness. And he categorize them in terms of 4 levels. So I'm going to just show these 4 levels here on the board. At the most sort of superficial level is the conventional meeting that we're probably relatively familiar with. You know, a bunch of people come together, the department heads give a report, and everybody leaves. This is the downloading meeting, and there's relatively little interaction. And as we progress down this kind of scale of meetings, greater and greater degree of collaboration, sharing, some exchange of ideas, co-creating, thinking together and achieving a solution together. And then at the bottom of this pyramid, which is what I'm going to call the holy grail of the environmental movement, is the presencing meeting. And this is perhaps a new phenomenon, perhaps not, but I want to just talk about 2 characteristics of this particular kind of meeting. Over on the right of the slide, you can see that in the presencing meeting, we have a situation where people are able to speak from the perspective of the collective. And I mean this in the most lofty sense of the word here. I mean the notion of the mind of the collective, the needs of the collective as being what's being channeled through each person in the group, as opposed to their own personal needs. So I'm thinking of you know, a question like the one posed by the Sufi poet Rumi, who says words with my mouth? We've all had that experience of being in a group in which something comes out of our own mouth and it's somehow drawn out of us by means of the needs of the energetic field that we're a part of. In my view, this faculty, this emergent faculty, represents the birth of a new entity here, and that is the birth of the collective as an agent, as an agent of action. In other words, potentially the thoughts of the future that are going to carry us forward are to some extent thought by the collective. And the actions that will come out are to some extent taken by the collective. I am sometimes thinking of a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. He said, "It is possible that the next Buddha will not take the form of an individual. The next Buddha may take the form of a community." An interesting quote to consider. The Buddha is one being. What needs to happen to all of us such that the community can be can take the form of the single enlightened being? And I take this very seriously.
Yeah, they'll all become
Together. Another quality of the collective that I think is important to mention is the way in which the shift in the way in which we experience silence. Going from something which is relatively antagonistic to our objectives of the group, at the upper levels of the group, to becoming something which is actually very hospitable, very rich with energy, and also rich with meaning and potential and comfortable place to dwell in the group that is in a presencing state of collective consciousness. In a way, the silence of the collective is a little bit like the silence of the mind. The one thought comes along and ends, and before the next thought begins, there is occasionally an opportunity to hang sort of suspended in that period in that point of emptiness, sort of staring into the light of one's own brilliance, as it were. That gap, after one thought is ended and before one thought begins, to some extent is the gap through which one's own personal brilliance can shine through. Just so, we can say that the gap, after one person has stopped speaking and before the next person has started speaking, could be considered the gap through which the collective brilliance of the group can shine through. I've experienced this, and I'm feeling this is a common experience. So again, we have this metaphor between the mind of the collective, and the qualities of the mind of the collective, and the qualities of the mind of the individual. Now, what emerges out of that collective brilliance, the ideas that are very often a group gets together and they say to themselves, well, a lot hinges on how brilliant is the idea that's coming forward. You get together and someone comes up with a fantastic idea and the way forward is very clear. But what emerges in a collective that's operating at that level are solutions that can be brought out to the community that carry a very energetic quality. And so this brings us to the next stage of this progression, in which we have the elevated state of individual consciousness mixing into the elevated state of the collective consciousness and creating offerings for the outside community. Next stage in the unfolding of the inside-out approach to social change. Now, imagine this group now that is so attuned to the needs of one another and the needs of the whole, and what it produces out of this, it's the flowering of its collective genius comes forward and goes to the rest of the community. The rest of the community immediately can notice and identify the energy of this offering. They want to be a part of this. They know this group that operates this way too is able to recognize the opportunity and recognize the needs of the surrounding community. This is a very kind of attractive, very sticky situation. And so you see this kind of organizing model throughout the transition town kind of process, creating these little pockets of an inclusive, kind of hospitable, positive, forward-looking local creations within their community. Same thing within the permaculture movement. And the idea that I'm thinking about is this aspect of networking which takes place when one of these aspects connects with another somewhere else, and there's somehow things are gaining momentum because these lively, beautiful offerings that are put in different places by various different kinds of action groups and initiatives beginning to stick together. And here we have a way in which this sort of like this next tier of realization of this model will then coming out into the world. Now, the specific tiers on this here, I think we can define different ways. That's not the main point. We could put in a regional tier, or we can put in, this is sort of a four-part system which seems to work pretty well. But the main important thing about this model is that it's inside out. Right? This is a local action model. It's working from the qualities within and through these different stages outwards. And it is counter to a notion of something which has this top-down element to it, changing legislation, kind of. And in every case, it is the quality of attention and intention which is exported out, which is to say the level of consciousness is exported out to the next tier. And that dictates the health of the next tier. That dictates the health, finally, of the world, such that we can create a healthy world for us all to to Linda Crossman. Okay, so that more or less concludes what I have to say on the subject of inside-out approach to social action. There's obviously a lot more to be said on the subject, and I'm sure that many people in the room can fill in lots of blanks with regards to this, and we can return to David's inquiry. Before closing, I want to just make reference to an organization which I've encountered in India and has been an enormous inspiration for all of this thinking, and not only that, but a model for the way in which an inside-out approach can be put into action, the both consciousness-based paradigm. In India, as you may know, they actually have not fallen in with the materialist paradigm to the same extent that we have in the West. In fact, even sometimes people would ask me, I spent some time over there, people would ask me and say, is it true that over in the US that everyone is a materialistic mindset? And it's just an amazing sort of like inquiry, But the name of this organization is All World Gayatri Parivar. And Parivar here means family, Gayatri means sun. All world means all faiths, all countries, all castes and creeds. And this year is the symbol of the All World Gayatri Parivar. It's called the Lal Mashal. And this depicts that community of forward-thinking, progressive individuals from all different cultures coming together to form a single body, and out of that is held up a light from the collective. So again, we have this the image of the through the qualities of togetherness, creating a new entity. And last thing I'll show you here, this is sort of the show and tell portion of our presentation to some extent. This is the motto of the All World Gayatri Parivar, and it has been extremely heartening to me thinking about this angle to social change and thinking about this aspect, to see massive crowds of people, thousands of people chanting this particular slogan. The slogan is Ham badlengi, yug badlega, ham sudrengi, yug sudrega. And badlengi means reform. When we reform ourselves, yug is era. The era will be reformed. And the second part is when we transform ourselves, the era will be transformed. And I created a sort of a somewhat loose translation here along the similar lines. Without personal reform, there can be no social reform, but when we transform ourselves, the era will surely follow. I mention this as some kind of encouragement that this type of thing is possible. It has been extremely effective and dynamic. So I'm not going to ask us all to chant this at this moment. That having been said, maybe we should switch over to opening it up for questions, or opening it up for discussion. Excuse me, I shouldn't say questions. That's actually hopefully not where we're headed. We'll go towards discussion.
What I like about the slide you showed just recently, the fourfold, from center out, is that it seems to me that, first of all, it's under my control because I'm changing myself. I'm not worrying about you. But as it progresses out from the individual, there's a self-correcting thing that should happen. Because if it was a bad idea, it's not going to get all the way to the end. So it means it's not all my responsibility.
Yeah.
I really like what you said about protest movements and how they set up an us-them consciousness, and when we started with Transition Town. It was about transforming ourselves and transforming our environment. But then suddenly the Occupy movement was with us, and we were called upon to be activists as well in the outer world. And this kind of created a dichotomy for me, and I wondered how can we do both. But now I'm wondering, since the protest movement has that characteristic, how is it that we can live our values within our community and also be, a positive voice for change in a social justice realm?
I think it takes all kinds. The reformed inner self is an ideal that we may all work for, but say when you go to the climate march, you have those of us who have a flailing inner self. And that's what makes up the demonstration or the celebration, whatever's happening. It's not like the only people you want there are the ones who can meditate properly or something. Or that you can't go out and do things until you've reached some level.
Then I had another question. With regard to what Dave Briggs had brought. If we do nothing, will the new paradigm come anyway? And it seems like from the chant that you brought and the ideas, one really has to do, one really has to focus on inner work. That's what we have to do in order to bring this new paradigm about, or speed it up, or speak the same language or something. We have to be active in an inner way.
Simon, can you go back to the slide with the two paradigms? The camel humps. Right. When I looked at that, I was thinking that really there were paradigms before it and probably paradigms after it that are going to be subject to their rises and falls. But I think that right before the materialistic paradigm, there was probably an anti-materialistic paradigm, or one that was, I don't know what exactly it was or how to describe it, but maybe it was more of a religion paradigm, that, a miracle paradigm, that the world operates based on faith and spirit only. And materialism hadn't had its day, hadn't been introduced. And now the next paradigm somehow, in my mind, needs to integrate some of the materialistic paradigm into it, because you can't just live and do nothing. You could, perhaps, some of us could do nothing or do inner work, but some outer work still has to go on to sustain our living. So there is some aspect of materialism that has to be recontextualized and assimilated into the new paradigm, integrated, so that the new paradigm consciousness-centered paradigm can also have some aspect of materialism tamed, or consumerism reappropriated for what's balanced and needed, rather than, exclusively. So that might be some of the work that we have to do on an inner level with this consciousness-centered paradigm, is what aspects of the material world are worth keeping, and what aspects of it really have to go. Maybe oil consumption has to go, and maybe some other aspects of the way food is distributed in the world has to stay because of the way we need to live in order for all of us to eat and survive.
One of the things that Thomas Kuhn said was that the cycle of paradigms is non-linear very often. So in other words, the one paradigm is sometimes replaced by another paradigm, and then the third paradigm might look more like the first than it does like the second. And a good example of this is Aristotelian mechanics are replaced by Newtonian mechanics are replaced by Einsteinian mechanics, and Einsteinian mechanics has some things in common with the Aristotelian mechanics that skips over the. And I think that this whole notion of the spiral of that Ken Wilber talks about, in which kind of goes around, but it's at a different level when it comes back again. It's similar to the way it was before, but it's actually at a higher level. It kind of continues like that.
So this is just a section of a spiral, these two pumps, somehow.
According to Ken, I suppose that's right, yeah. Elizabeth was looking at the slide, she said, well, if it's sustainable culture, then how is it going to go up and come down? If it comes down, then it must not be sustainable. That's a good point you have there. But I guess the idea is that the culture continues, but I guess the paradigm always will be one after the next somehow, even though it seems.
Even though each new one is like sort of similarly tempted to latch onto it.
We've arrived.
I was just thinking that, like you said, we want it one after another, but the next one might be improved upon the first, like the third might be an improvement on the first, and the second is different than the third. But it seems that once you have something that fulfills the needs of people in the community,
Could you talk just a
oh,
little
no, I
bit
said,
about-
once you have a paradigm that fulfills the needs of the whole community, then you wouldn't need a new one. It seems that that would be something to aim for.
Yes, but, those of us who lived through the 60s and rebelled against the materialistic paradigm had very different ways of carrying on into the future with a new way. Some people wanted to create utopias. Some people went to the farm in Tennessee, and I think that's still a going concern. But, and there were the huge vegetables grown in Scotland in connection with the elementals and the spiritual beings, the plant devas. But it can't stay, it doesn't achieve perfection and stay there. It's always moving and it can't be static or it'll be dead. And in the movement, there's contradiction and there's conflict, which makes it need a constant renewal. So, we can aim at something, but it's like we're never really going to get there. It has to be always worked on, all the time.
One of the controversial aspects of Thomas Kuhn's work is that he said that successive paradigms they don't approximate truth to an increasing degree. Each paradigm is judged not in terms of its proximity to truth. The paradigm actually doesn't pick up truth. The paradigm is judged for its capacity to fulfill a certain job. It helps the community do a certain job. So I think this notion, and that is the way we judge one against the other. It's a very relativistic kind of approach. We don't necessarily say that this one's better than that one because it's truer. It's just better at accomplishing this particular functionality. So if we think about the functionality that we needed to create the industrial era, and to create the mastery of the physical world, yes, the materialistic paradigm is the one for that. Now we have a different job. Now we have to figure out how to persevere. We have to figure out how to live in balance with nature, with 9 billion people. So for a paradigm for that, we need a very different construct.
I think a way of characterizing the difference between the cultures might be to use the word atomistic rather than material. That is, I'm not sure that we actually do have an individual consciousness. I'm not sure that exists. We in our consciousness, we're in communication with a group, maybe an imaginary group, and the conceit of the material culture is that we're separate beings, and that we aren't interrelated, and that we're atomized, which isn't really true, or at least seen from another paradigm, it isn't really true. The trick is to be, it seems that the individual work is to be more aware of and intentional about relating as a group, relating to other, being more aware of the process of communicating with a group, of the consciousness of the group, which goes on completely unaware in the other culture. That is, we pattern ourselves, we mirror ourselves, we form collective action, but it goes on completely unconsciously. We don't know. It's the marketing that controls us. We aren't aware of what controls us, but we are participating in a mass culture nonetheless. The trick is being intentional about, and you certainly put a lot of effort into this. Maybe you should speak more about what the techniques or the actual practice of becoming more aware of the effects that we have on each other, and the ways that we participate effectively in a group consciousness that cares for us as a group, rather than neglecting us, atomizing us again. And part of the problem is that we go home we have moments of reaching this, and we go home, we go back into that other culture, almost inexorably, because it's the background that we retreat to. That we almost can't stay in this consciousness. We go home from the rallies, and we're back in. So we live, the transformed culture lives against the background, and we each live against that background. We drop back into the atomized condition.
But maybe not as far.
We need to live together, John. You have to make a housing project for all of us to be living in close proximity.
I think that you really hit it on the head, like the paradigm, like what's at the crux of the paradigm shift that we're living in is this idea that we're not actually separate. So I'm curious, in the evolution of a paradigm, there's a feedback loop that is like, well, how does one operate in that new consciousness? And then how does that operation affect the action? And then how does that action inform the paradigm? So it's actually building the paradigm in the form of action. So we can't know, really, fully what that new paradigm is. We can just understand, like, so what process births the paradigm comes from the questions that we seek to answer. Like, what does it mean to be aware of a group consciousness? Or like, how does it make me feel to recognize that I'm really deeply connected to everyone in this room? And therefore your actions and your circles and your choices and your personalities, what makes us unique, all of that. And then, I just want to say that, but I also had this other thought that it seems another indicator of a paradigm shift that we're living in is similarly within our interconnectedness, but the idea of the duality in general. So if we can embrace an idea that we're not separate from each other, therefore if we find ourselves using the terms them a lot, and it's or we have to share to change their behavior, it seems to me that we'll know where we are in the paradigm a little bit, maybe perhaps, if that gap between us and them and our action and your action or whatever that becomes is smaller. Thus connecting that inside and that outside place. So therefore it's not as much of, well, if we just sit on our cushions, the world will change. Or if we go to the streets, the world will change. But we stop seeing both of those as one action, but more as like a way or a being. And then that would then allude to this like idea that the new story will emerge and the old problems dissolve. So in some way, I think that's speaking a little bit to what you were saying, David, about like, what do we do? Like, we're not really doing anything. We don't have to do anything with the emerging of a new way or a new paradigm because it outgrows the old and becomes obsolete. I don't know, so it kind of seems a little bit like there is non-action in that place, but similarly, there's an awareness around that unity. And so when I'm in the streets or when I'm on the cushion, I don't see that as being that different because either way they're both informing an internal process that's birthing a new paradigm in my subconscious. You know, like it's kind of neat to make those connections.
This is one of the points that's been made about this presencing level of collective process, is that it is to some extent the synthesis of our organizing life and our prayer life. In so doing, it's the synthesis of what we would do for the outside world and what we do for our inner, to respond to our inner needs. And I think with that kind of thing, we have a non-dual moment. Inside and outside are fed with the same seed, as it were. That's why I say that this is the holy grail of the environmental movement, because there's no burnout in this, right? It's rejuvenating and service. You know, it serves and it rejuvenates oneself. It serves both oneself and other at the same time. So there's no kind of choice. So I think this whole question about do we need to do anything is, to me, it gets at the crux of like, well, what is action in a way? Well, is pure action action? Or if I say exactly what needs to be said, am I saying anything? There's a way in which I'm not saying anything. Same thing with action. Action with no resistance, with no ego, no non-dual action. What about this phrase? Non-dual action. Action which is enacted from a point of no separation of self and other. Are you doing anything? You might not be doing anything, but you're accomplishing a lot.
It seems to me there's some kind of maybe potentially valuable inquiry in like what nothing would look like. So like is there doing in nothing, and how does one choose to take up that space? It seems to be maybe indicative of how it would impact the next moment. You know, and then therein lies the whole like, what is nothing? It's like no thing, which kinds of leads into this like idea of like shifting out of a materialistic paradigm, which maybe we don't relate to nothing the way that we do now.
I'm reminded of the, sorry.
Nope.
I'm reminded of the phrase from A Course in Miracles, nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists, herein lies peace. And just the recognition that our breath is nothing and everything, and that we may have wisdom in knowing what not to do, and also the recognition that we're all trapped. I know I went to the protest in 2011 at the White House against Keystone, and I went by airplane, which I would never do except to go to a climate event. And I was talking to the person at the airport, and he said, well, how could you, you're so hypocritical, you've come by airplane. And I remember saying to him, like, we're all trapped. I'm doing this to reach a place, and I would, anyway, but I didn't go on and on, but basically I was just like, we're all trapped, and instead of trying to defend my action and using carbon to get there, I was like, just he kind of, we weren't adversaries. It's like we're all working on this together, and what not to do, doing nothing, doing what we can in the most thoughtful way, and just breathing through this is at least we can breathe through this together with the rest of the planet. And it is nothing, it's just a breath.
I think one of the themes that used to surface a lot at the center is this paradigm of, quote, radical interconnectivity. And to some extent, this also carries some of the clues to how this all works. And I think that there is a way in which, yes, the notion of the material definition of a human being does have us relatively separated from one another in physical terms. And clearly as physical beings we're separate beings. But there is a question as to whether or not the degree of, if there is a degree of connectivity at deeper levels of consciousness, sort of by means of which you can kind of intuit someone else's thoughts, and this whole question about compassion and other things relating with that interconnectivity, which for me goes a long way to short-circuiting this bind that we get in as environmentalists, which says something like, well, how can I not be hypocritical to ask someone else doing it if I'm still living at this level, right? But yet, for me to stop doing this, that to some extent makes me, I have to exclude myself from much of what goes on in society, and furthermore, that's only a drop in the bucket, really, and really what needs to happen is changes at the upper levels, the legislation and the sort of the big structural changes, but I'm just one person, I can't change that. So why bother doing anything? Sort of like we're in this catch-22. The personal realm is a drop in the ocean. The political realm is a uphill battle, but that kind of sense of futility, I think, is all sort of based within this notion of the materialistic notion, because if we take into account this notion of radical interconnectivity, then whatever I do, can have an enormous effect on the whole world. Whatever I would do in my own life, again, to me, it short circuits it in a way, to get us out of the blind of like getting caught between these two different futile poles of inactivity. Well, maybe I'll just see if there's anyone that wants to have the last word.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's called quantum simultaneity, or, but it sounds like radical connectedness. And in quantum physics, if two particles are brought together, they behave similarly. And then this is as a physics experiment. They're taken apart, miles and miles apart, and the polarity of one particle is switched. The other one will switch faster than the speed of light. And they don't know why this connectivity happens. But what's interesting, and what I thought might be good for closing, is here's a group of people. Maybe we've all kind of gotten polarized a certain way. And now when we leave here, one person might make a change. Who knows? All of us might have a little switch. So.
I'd just like to thank you, Simon.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you all. When we were on the team working towards sustainability, we were on the winning team. So we can enjoy that. It's really, really great to be able to talk about these things with you. I really appreciate it very, very much.